We concluded with our Noahic study, and it was very, very, to me, this study, and even as God's been taking me through the insights of his covenants, it's strengthening my walk, strengthening my talk, and I learned so much from the Noahic that I am just very excited that we're going to step into the Abrahamic. The Abrahamic covenant, as we know it, again, it's God's promise and redemption. God's promise and redemption, as we know, that word promise is interchangeable with covenant. It's covenant of redemption. So tonight, as we get into our study, I want to just lay some backdrop as to where we're going with this, but also I'm very excited as to where we're going with this. The title of tonight's study, as we begin this Abrahamic series, is The Ascent. The Ascent. And if you will, turn with me to Bereshit, or Genesis, chapter 12. Bereshit, or Genesis chapter 12. As we start in the study, it looks and says, Bereshit chapter 12, verse 1. Now Adonai said to Abraham, get thee out of your country and away from your kinsmen. You know, stepping from the Noahic, as you step into this, it looks like there's no setup for it. We run into chapter 12, and you open up, and boom, there he is. You look up, and the command comes forth as it goes to define what God would have him to do. But I think in order to try to get a little bit more understanding of what God is doing to him and why and how, we need to back our study up just a little bit. I mean, back our entry up just a little bit. But from where we are right now, I'm just going to let you know, our study begins as we step into the study with Abraham, or Abram at this point. It picks up 10 generations after the flood with Abraham. As he picks up this thought, when God tries and asks him this question, or gives this command, we see something interesting in the life of Abraham, which is the same thing we kind of noticed in the life of Noah. I said, for those who think sometimes we're getting too old to be used of God because it feels like time is just flying by, and you know, I'm looking up and thinking, like, I read about all these great works and see a lot of things that people are doing today, and sometimes I think I'm just getting their life's getting by me. They got everything going for them, and I'm getting older. But we find out in the life of Noah that God used him. He called him when he was 500 years old. Same thing will happen here on this one. This call from Abraham begins at his age of 75 years old. On the second half of his life, God is about ready to do the bigness of his work. You know, we scour down, try to look at all what transpired within his life within the very first 75 years, and you hardly see nothing. You don't hardly hear anything that transpired within those first 75 years. But it's this second half, on this backside of his life, is where the bigness starts to show. And something truly happens. I love it when it said, the first 75 years of Abraham's life just passed over almost in silence. But when he responded to the call, it marked the true beginning of his life. If we back up to chapter 11, in the beginning, we run into an interesting piece. Because as we come out of Noach and go through all the genealogies, we come to an interesting place where it comes into chapter 11 and opens up with the Tower of Babel, or Babel. And the story of the Tower of Babel, there's an interesting thing that transpires specifically as you look at this study, and I'm not going to do a study on the Tower of Babel right now, but it plays a part, and it gives the backdrop as to what's taking place and how the origin of when Abraham started moving like he's doing, or for God to make his call. And it says in the study, the whole earth used the same language and the same words. And it came about as they traveled east. They traveled from the east. They found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they lived there. And they said one to another, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them in the fire." So they had bricks for building in the stone and clay for the mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that has its top reaching up into the heaven, so that we can make a name for ourselves and not be scattered all over the earth." That's an incredible piece, because when you hear that, it sounds like what a very ambitious desire, to build this huge city and to build this large building as such, to make a name for themselves. But the backdrop comes into it is that when you read into it even more so, because it says, next verse, it says, "And Adonai came down to see the city and the tower, and the people were building. And Adonai said, 'Look, the people are united. They all have a single language, and see what they're starting to do. At this rate, nothing they set out to accomplish will be impossible to them. Come, let's go down and confuse the language that they won't understand each other's speech.' And so from there, Adonai scattered them all over the earth, and they stopped the building of the city. And for this reason, it is called Babel, or confusion, because Adonai confused the language of the whole earth. And from there, Adonai scattered them all over the earth." That was the original challenge that God told Adam, and he told Noach. As soon as Noah got off the ship, he told him, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth." Again, I'm not going to go into the full study on this piece as such. But what they kept here doing was like disobedience. It's arrogant disobedience, because they wanted to stop, instead of going in and spreading out throughout the earth, they wanted to camp there and stop the spreading so they will not be scattered. But God did a big thing with them when he turned out and confounded the law. God did a big thing when he stood and confounded the language. All right, the story of the Tower of Babel is a dividing point, because if you look at the genealogy, there's something that takes place that we should be mindful of. As it runs down through the whole genealogy, this Tower of Babel, and the way it fits within Abraham's life, is a very good dividing point. It's a splitting point, because if you come down through the generations, you come to a name that's called Peleg. Peleg is about the fifth generation down from Abraham. And they said, they make an interesting thing that took place during that life of Peleg. And then in the genealogy, in fact, you can find where it talks about what I'm going to say, the chapter above. Go to chapter 10, look at verse 25. That speaks of that. And it says, at that time, that the earth was divided. That's interesting when they put that there. Because it's something that transpired that divided them as we would see them, as you would hear it. So during the time of the Tower of Babel, when they see it, the names and the genealogy that they put forth at this particular time used as a great dividing point, a line of separating from the descending nations of Noach. It says, this whole thought, is as I open it up, I want to just start here because it sets a tone it sets us up for our study for where we want to go to from here. For in this story of Tower of Babel, it records how God called Abraham, this whole nation, this generation, out of a pagan world and made him some astounding promises. Why? Because the city, as we've seen, that Tower of Babel, was a city that was the predominant force in the world at the time. When they went to split, they said it seemed like the whole world was all one language, and it's all migrating to be captured in this one city. But it's from this pagan mindset God had called him when he lived in the land of Ur. 5 generations again from this Tower of Babel. But this tower that stood there, what transpires, why would God call him? Why would he do what he's doing with him at this point? This Tower of Babel, as it stands in chapter 11, just before you run into chapter 12, and it shows when God speaks, something bigger had to happen. This city was wholly consumed that it, with the power and the thought of the paganry, that this, as we speak in terms of the Tower of Babel, it comes across as the embodiment of the ungodly power altogether. But they said they're totally consumed with idolatry. So what is he saying? What am I saying in the gist of all that? Every resident at that time was a servant of the moon god. But something transpired at the lineage of Peleg. It said things were divided. It said the ascending thought split among them. That's where we find Eber that comes out, where you really had a thought as to what was transpiring, what was God moving, when you had a mindset that was coming off of Noah that was God-fearing, and a land where people are split off another way, where they can build a tower and become worshiping another God. In the midst of this, the thing with Peleg, you can almost see where that line of Abraham comes out. Where a line is something that where awakening of Yahweh, or awakening of the definitive thought of God took place. This is, I think, is big because we find ourselves still facing this thought today. What is that thought? God had called him from the land of Ur, and when he went to speak with him, he says he wanted him to come out from among them. That city was the city of Babylon, or the city of Babel, had a residue that followed the people as they went further until God had separated them. And that makes sense as to what he tells them and why. Why? Because every resident was a servant of the moon god. The moon god at that time, to leave the land, for Abraham to let me put it this way. For Abraham to leave the land, everyone during that time thought of the gods as being territorial. So for God to say, get up and take off and leave from here, it'd be like Abraham absorbing the fact that where I go, he was not going to take what he left behind, which is in this moon god. Because they viewed the gods as territorial, so when God asked him to leave, it was extremely difficult. The moon god at that time went by the name of Herky. He wasn't a Hawkeye. We know that name. That name comes up with another name that's more common to us. We know the name Azala. An interesting note that took place in the call. If you look in the genealogy, it says, it is taught. Now, initially, it was Terach, his father, that received the call. But when the call comes, it says, I love this piece. It says, an interesting thing comes in, is that a truth, Mordecai declared a truth, or a God pattern, that was realized in Esther. What do you mean? What do you mean, Rabbi? If the call originally come to Tiarch, and they said, why did he move? Because the scripture reads that says that he took his family and they moved as far as the land of Ur. He was supposed to have been going to Canaan. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But he landed at Ur. And then the thought came to him saying, when Esther was confronted with Mordecai, when they seen what was going to transpire among the people, the nation, she had a choice. And when Mordecai came to her, he made this comment to her. He asked her to go before the king and to petition to save the nation, to save the country, to save the people. And then she said she was fearful for her life. We know the story. And he says, don't think that you're safe in the palace where you're at. Don't think just because you're queen and where you're sitting that you will be saved. She said, because he says, if you don't arise, God will bring deliverance to someone else. Now that is a God pattern. So Mordecai, in the midst of this, he says he was mindful of the fact to know that there was a promise, there was a covenant that was made, that God would not allow his people to be destroyed. Somewhere, somehow, I don't care if it's whether it be you or you, God's going to use someone else because he's already spoken it. So when he said that to Esther, he says, don't think you're sitting there and you can be safe, because if you don't move, God can raise it up for someone else. But how do you know that you weren't set here for such a time as this? In the same way, he tries to look at a call, or God can put forth a call to Tiarch. But whether he embraces it or not, he says, if you don't embrace it, I'll use someone else. So in the same thing, that's key to us as such, because a lot of times we may end up getting something that's dropped in our spirit and we don't want to because it's too uncomfortable. And God's going to try and say, but my purpose will still prevail. So if Tiarch, if God moved it than him, he didn't move. I see that God pattern that takes place where God decides I can use someone else. Tiarch's response, I like this. They said Tiarch's response was like that of Jonah. Instead of him taking off and going toward Canaan like he should have, he turned to go the opposite direction and went northwest to Mesopotamia instead of southwest to Canaan. His direction changed. And when he got to when they got to the Mesopotamia area, he camped and he stayed in the land of the earth. Now, how many of you guys know that if God dropped dropped that call into his life and he didn't move, partial obedience isn't a little obedience. You know, if you get a call, if you just do part of it, it isn't just a little obedience. God calls it disobedience, period. That's what we're seeing in the book of Samuel, when God told Saul to take out Agag, the king, all the Amalekites. You remember? Samuel's real big. He went and said he tried to do it, but no, obviously he didn't do it, because as soon as he runs into Samuel, he looks up and says, Samuel says, how can you disobey? He said, no, I did everything the Lord asked. We wiped them out and we did this and we got that. And he said, and he stopped. What's this bleating of the sheep I'm hearing? Okay, those are the ones we set aside to sacrifice to him. Those are the good ones. We got rid of all the ugly ones. And we wiped out all the men and everything, but, we even kept the king alive. Little obedience is not, little obedience is not just a little obedience. Oh, okay, there you go. Oh, she got it down.
Yeah, that's good.
She said it says disobedience. So in doing so, when thinking in terms of the structure, the split, the godly line of Peleg coming forth, from the godly line where God moves through after splitting the languages at Babel. And then he turns around and he says, where he comes down to the line of Peleg, 10 generations back, and grabs Abraham and he speaks to him now and tells him, which is where we begin, come out among them. When God gives Abraham this call, he speaks to him in this call, we see this command, and Abraham's command was a fourfold command. Especially look in the backdrop and come back, and now God comes in verse 12. We open up in verse 12 where God just comes up with a very definitive voice to Abraham. This voice that he gives him comes across as a fourfold command. He tells him, one, get yourself out of your country. He could have just said, why don't you skip and leave? He's just going to break this thing down. I don't know if it's a hereditary way. He's going to say, we'll make this clear if you're going to try to embrace this thought. First off, I want you to get yourself out of your country. He probably looked at him and says, and away from your kindred. Everything there, up to that point, is worshiping moon gods and different gods. And God's trying to say, I need to make this clear. Get away from the country and away from your kinsmen. Oh, yeah, I want you to get away from your father's house. And then hits him with the fourth one, very definitive. And go to the land that I will show you. 4 thoughts. Out of the country, out of the land, out of your father's house, and go where I'm going to take you in order to make this work. The critical part of this, and the thing that's awesome about it, there's 7 very significant elements that were embedded in this call. Very significant elements, long, far-reaching. He tells him this, I will make of you a great nation. What does that mean? He's now speaking in terms of great in number and great in significance. Now that, for Abraham to move, was big. Because as he stood there, he can see right there in the midst of them, when the voice came, that Sarai is barren. God's telling you, I'm going to make you a great nation. And they don't even have the first kid yet. He knows that she's barren, and both he and her are great in years. Could you imagine? I'm excited now, waiting for my grandchild. And I'm not 75 years old. For the grandchild, God's telling me, says, I'm going to make you a great nation, and you're 75 years old. We're going to begin it with one child. And everything's going to be big, but you're not going to start until you're 75. Now, if the kid is going to be a teenager, he's 20 years, put 20 years on top of that. Where's he at? Well, okay. His first thought came right behind it. It says, not only will I make you a great nation, I'm speaking in terms of number and significance. You're not just going to be just anybody. Second thought, he turns around and says, and I will bless you. Embedded with the call, he says, what does that mean? He said, you're going to enjoy material prosperity that the world couldn't even begin to comprehend. For God trying to say, it's one thing, my mother loves me, and my sister can love me, but then trying to say, we're going to make you so happy and prosperous, but see, they can only go as far as their wallet can go. How do you like that the God of the universe, when the heavens is his, and the earth is yours, he says, I'm going to make you materially prosperous. I like this. The other one, he came back with him, he says, I will make your name great. Now, what is the significance of that? As I was reading, God told him, he says, I'm going to make your name great. He says, this speaks of his very essence of being, of who you are. This is your true identity. He says, not only will he acquire fame, but he'll also be highly esteemed as a man of superior character. Remember I told you I was reading in that story with the Tower of Babel? They turned and said, we're going to make ourselves a great name, and make ourselves great. And then God comes down and twists the language a little bit. You know, it's one thing when you're trying to make yourself great, but could you imagine God trying to say, no, I'm going to make you great. You can do all you can to try to make yourself great, but when God looks at you and tries to say, I will make you great. And when I speak it, it is. Because when he spoke it, something went inside his whole makeup, inside his whole DNA, because he changed at the moment when the breath spoke, because when God says it, it is. Amen. So it's not just about setting up and trying to make your name haughty. God's going to try to show you, I will define what greatness is in you. Then he tells him, he says, and you shall be a blessing. Now, this is powerful. He says, you shall be a blessing. What do you mean? He says, you will be the benchmark by which a blessing is determined. If anyone talks about being blessed and being highly favored, he says, how do you determine that? Look at Abraham. You're going to be the benchmark, the standard bearer by which blessings are determined. In other words, he said, literally, you when people look at you and they're going to try to define it, you know, I see people now and they look and say, how you know? I'm blessed. I don't think blessed like blessed, is what we're saying. And then he comes back to another one. There's 7 strong qualities. He says, and I will bless those who bless you. What do you mean? He says, those who bless you, they will enjoy God's blessings of well-being. Anyone who stops in favor and does you well, I will bless you. And I will curse him who curses you. In other words, he had to trap that little word and try to say, what does it mean by that? He says, he who mistreats you brings disaster upon himself. How? You know, sometimes we go back and forth. You know about this word love. When Peter says, when God said, look, Peter says, Peter, do you love me? He said, yes, Lord, I love you. And he said again, Peter, do you love me? Yes, Lord, I love you. Peter, do you love me? Yes, Lord, I love you. Now, we use that word a lot within our society and among our phraseologies and people share things. So the words can get, somebody said, I don't know, how deep are you saying that? What do you mean by that? Same thing has happened here. Because even when I look at this word here, and God says, he says, I will curse him that curses you. I said, and that word, in its verb rendering, comes in and says this. The rendering gets something a little bit obscure within it, between 2 words. But when he says that curses you, what do you mean, who curses you? He says, to those that try to belittle or defame or abuse or cause harm, they come up to you and they try to belittle, or remove the weight of who you are. They seek to defame or to abuse you, to bring harm to you. So they're trying to curse you. That's what it says. And then he says, I will curse him. And the word comes in and says, what do you mean? God takes his word, and his word when he says, I will curse him, is not to abuse or defame. It's not eye for eye. His word has a stronger rendering when it comes in and says he will curse him. That word curse comes to a point where he says he can place him under the ban. You know, in the word, they use that word in Joshua. We talked about Jericho. They weren't supposed to touch it. He said the word was harim. This word is banned. It's a hard word. God says, as it relates to God's response, it's a much stronger implication. It literally means, God says, to strip or deny him of the benefits of divine providence. I will affect his destiny.